Welcome to Creative Piecemeal. I'm Tammy Takaishi, a board-certified music therapist. Join me each week as a new guest from across the fine and creative arts spheres shares struggles, triumphs, laughs, words of wisdom, and more in authentic, thought-provoking, and inspiring interviews. Hello and welcome to Creative Piecemeal. I'm Tammy Takaishi. Today I'm joined by award-winning writer Bob Johnson. His latest debut is a short story collection called The Continental Divide, out earlier in 2025. So depending on when you listen to this episode, comes out February 11th. If you're listening later, you can pick it up via links in the show notes. But The Continental Divide chronicles a side of the Midwest seldom talked about. A country woman must make a Sophie's choice regarding her family's survival. A small-town marshal hunts his own son for murder. And a former football hero must face his role in a brutal locker room ritual. Ferocious and real, these 14 tales explore with empathy and sometimes a touch of humor an interconnected cast of characters living in a small town along the St. Lawrence Divide in northern Indiana, where men, women, and children struggle to find their way and sometimes, although not always, succeed. And a little bit about Bob. He is an award-winning writer, graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, and his work has been previously published in The Common, Philadelphia Stories, Volume 1, Brooklyn, the Barcelona Review, and elsewhere. So, Bob, really glad to have you on the show to talk about your work and the creative process and all of those things. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I can't wait to talk about everything.
Yeah. I'd love to start with what inspired you not only to become a writer, but also to write this latest short story collection.
Well, which would you like me to address first? What inspired me to become a writer?
Yeah, that sounds great.
It seems right. Well, first of all, I was an ADD kid and I wasn't good at math. I wasn't good at chemistry and physics. I got distracted easily and was a regular disappointment to my parents and teachers because, they knew I was smart. They knew I had a good vocabulary. I was always out ahead in that stuff. I was a good speller. I was a good reader, but I couldn't focus. I couldn't concentrate. And I've thought a long time of what inspired me to become a writer. I was always the kid that had the idea. I always had the idea. And that was true from the beginning. I sometimes think back to stories about my family, from my mother's side especially. My grandfather was a superintendent of schools and a very, very respected man. But he also had a kind of a schizophrenic streak and would sometimes go off into binges where he would pose as a visiting lecturer and things like that and give talks to ladies groups and stuff. And he would stalk people. He would stalk women especially. And in fact, he reminds me a little bit of the Joseph Cotton character in Hitchcock's The Shadow of a Doubt, who was able to kind of maintain a path of murder under the cover of that guise. And so my grandfather was that way, and my mother didn't stalk people, and I wouldn't call her schizophrenic, although I might actually. But that gene pool, that genetic soup that I inherited, I think is what started me along the writing path. This ADD kid who always had an idea and wasn't good at anything else. I was always good at writing. And I knew I was good at writing from the get-go. I mean, when I was 7 and 8 years old, I was trying to write stories. And I talk about that in my latest newsletter. Listeners are welcome to sign up for. But so in high school, I never dreamed that writing would be something that I would do as a vocation, avocation, a regular thing. But I knew I was good at it, and I knew I was inclined that way. And then in late college, I began to write for real and ended up going to the Indiana University Writers Conference, where I won the award for the best manuscript. And I was beginning to find who I was, if you know what I mean. I was beginning to find the Bob Johnson that I was meant to be. And at Indiana, at the IU Writers Conference, I ran into a writer, friend, mentor named Leonard Michaels, who was a novelist and short story writer, and he got me into Iowa. And I was so green when I went to Iowa. I was about 25, and I hadn't been a good student. I mean, I wasn't a good student, and I hadn't even been good at literature, English classes, which you might think I would have been good at it, but I blame that on my incapacity to focus and pay attention and keep attention on things. And so when I went to Iowa, I was surrounded by all these really excellent writers, scholars, Yale and Harvard grads and the like. And there I was, having had written really seriously, maybe just a couple of stories in my life. Next thing you know, I'm at Iowa. So it was a time, but it was extraordinarily fruitful. I made terrific friends. I wrote terrible, terrible wandery stories that did not mimic the one that got me into Iowa, because I was trying to be like Faulkner and I was trying to be like Flannery O'Connor. I was trying to be like Hemingway, and I was imitating people. And it was when I got out of it. It's almost like I could tell you the whole story. You'd never get a question in again. When I left Iowa, I was married and had a baby coming, and almost immediately got a job in commercial television. And I put my writing pen down essentially for 30 some years. Didn't pick it up again until I retired. So the serious writing that I've done since has happened in the last 12 years or so of my retirement. And that's what led now to this collection, the Continental Divide.
It sounds like, being in the Iowa Writers Workshop, even though it happened earlier in your career and things took a turn that you weren't expecting, it still had an impact and made an impression. I was wondering, if you had to do it all over again, would you still choose the winding, unpredictable path that you took?
It's almost like I had no choice. I didn't have any choice. I was writing earlier than Iowa. I wrote a handful of stories, one which prompted my getting into Iowa, that prompted Leonard Michaels to kind of take me on, which I'm very grateful. Yes, I would take that winding path again, although it was a struggle for sure, because as I said, I was so green. I never felt like I deserved to be there. And not like my ADD tendencies kicked off either. We would have these novel workshops that where we were supposed to read a novel for a week and sit and talk about them with these wonderful teachers and professors. And I would often sort of get around to reading the novel the night before. I oftentimes wouldn't have it finished, and I would hate myself for that. I hate myself less about that now because I know that's kind of how I was made. And I'm much, much better since retiring. Although I was good at my job in TV, but I was much, much better since retiring because I don't have anything else to do. I was never a multitasker. Now I just write and write and write all day, every day. Drives my wife crazy, She says, "Stop writing." And I do. I put it aside, but I'm always thinking about it. It's just grinding on all the time.
I love that even though you took a break from it, you still found your way back to it. I think that's inspiring for anyone who's in a position where they find themselves on a career path they didn't expect, and maybe they're missing some sort of creative aspect in their life that they had done. It's never too late. Well, I mean, sometimes it's too late, but hypothetically, it's never too late to come back and to find yourself again.
It's never too late. And that's what I tell everybody. It's never too late. Now, what I had going for me was this monkey on my back. I tell the story that every New Year's Eve, my wife and I would go out to a bar. Usually, for many years, it was the same bar. And we'd sit at the bar over a beer, and she'd say, "What are your New Year's resolutions?" And I'd say, "I want to write." And that was many, many, many years before I retired. I want to write this year. But as I said, I was not a multitasker. And so I had, in the TV job, I had 30 odd people reporting to me at different times. And I had budgets to manage. And it was also a creative job. I was the promotion manager. So I was in charge of selling the station, marketing it with graphics and promos and radio spots and the like, which was fulfilling and fun, and which I was pretty good at. But I couldn't write. I couldn't go home and write then. No chance. I went home and sat around and watched TV and sort of wished that I was writing. But then when I retired, the chance came along. So yeah, I call that inspiring. I do. And I also agree that it's never too late. But the fact is, it just never left me. And when I picked it up, when I look back now at when I first retired and began to write again, I'm not surprised. It was always there. It was always nagging and nagging and nagging at me. And when I could finally do it again, it's been the best time of my life. I'm doing my work. I'm doing what I was meant.
And this is your debut. It's a collection of short stories. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but being someone also from the Midwest, I'm really looking forward to it. And it's gotten some amazing praise and reviews, including one from Erica Worth, author of White Horse, where she says, Johnson's stories are so complex, so powerful that from the first line, you know you're going to be shaken to your core. This is the Midwest no one talks about. This is the Midwest I know well, and there is not a collection out there like this. That must have been, along with all of the other praise you've gotten, that must have felt so validating, so groundbreaking that after all these years, you've been able to get something out that you've been wanting to, you were able to write, and then it receives phenomenal press. I mean, just wonderful.
It's been wonderful validation. It certainly has. I'm kind of a nut that way. I'm kind of a compliment hog. It's like there's never enough, but doggone it. Yeah, I did like those blurbs. I hope to get some more as the book goes out into the world. I hope to get more good reviews. But as I was listening to Jeff Weddle, one of your podcasts, who's a writer and a poet, and he said, I don't write for anybody else. I write for myself. And that's true of me also. I don't know what else to write but what I write. And in fact, he said something like he doesn't follow trends. He doesn't. And I have friends and family that send me articles about my odds for getting published, for making it happen in this world, in this contemporary literary world. As a man of my age and gender and demographics, I barely read those articles. I don't care. They wouldn't change me. I can't do anything about it. I can't do anything about what I write about. It is like you and I were saying pre-podcast about the weather. It is what it is. I kind of hate that phrase, but it works in this moment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the inspiration behind the Continental Divide. Why did you choose to tell it in this manner? Where did you get the general inspiration? Whatever you can tell us without giving spoilers away, of course.
Yeah, sure, of course. Well, first of all, I grew up in a small town in northern Indiana, Middlebury, Indiana, and the town in my collection is called Mount Moriah, and there's no doubt that it is, in some respect, patterned after my growing up, my childhood in Middlebury, which is literally a one-stoplight town with Amish farms, circling it, and 1,000 people. And so I wrote stories about that. When Erica said, this is the Midwest nobody talks about, well, I know what she means, and I've heard other people say the same thing. But I think that people do talk about, I think they're saying that the collection sort of lays waste to the notion of picket fences and white houses and picket fences and amber waves of grain and that sort of thing. And yeah, it does. But lots of collections do the same thing. Donald Ray Pollock's short story collection, Knock 'em Stiff, is about a literal town in Ohio named Knock 'em Stiff. And that also lays waste to the notion that the Midwest is a bunch of kind-hearted flyover people that go to church every Sunday. Of course, I told somebody recently, good and evil walk hand in hand wherever you go. And that happens in my collection for sure. But the inspiration came from that growing up. The title, The Continental Divide, came from I happen to live along the St. Lawrence Divide, which is the Northwest Continental Divide. The lesser known one, the one we think most about, is the one through the Rockies, where the water that falls on one side of the Rockies flows to the Atlantic and on the other side to the Pacific. Well, the St. Lawrence Divide works the same way, only the water goes north and south, north to the Lake Michigan and south to the Gulf of Mexico. There's a sign on US 20 West near my home that says that you're crossing the Continental Divide. And I saw that sign again and again when I was writing and after I retired and thinking all the time about what my next story might be. And I wrote it about this woman who lives in a house right on the Continental Divide, the country woman that you referenced earlier who had to make the Sophie's Choice. Her name is Edith, and she lives on the Continental Divide, and her husband, the Mister, is dead. And she lives now with her adult son, LT, who's 45 and recently out of the penitentiary. He was in for meth, but also for indecent liberties. Don't quite explain right now, and I don't exactly explain in the story what those liberties are, but you can imagine what they are. Anyway, so I found myself writing that story, the Continental Divide, and about the choices this woman has to make, and the divides between gender, between toxic masculinity, between man and woman, between the law of the city, of the town, of the state, versus human law, the law of one's heart, and the law of perhaps Edith has a kind of a code that she follows that is outside the law as we understand it anyway. So I was writing about all these divides. I didn't really know that I was until I was done. And then it strikes me that all stories are about those kinds of divides. All fiction is men and women, personal law versus human law, gender, violence, redemption, salvation, darkness, and light. All fiction is about that, all that stuff. I'm not doing anything new.
As you say, you may not be doing anything new, but you are putting the Bob Johnson spin to it, your perspective. And I think that's what makes it beautiful. That's what makes creating beautiful, is we may be telling the same stories, but telling it from our own perspectives. And that's
for sure. Absolutely.
It's worth it, and I'm so glad that you've had the chance to do that. I'm curious, do you want to talk about anything that you have upcoming after the Continental Divide?
Well, I continue to write stories, and I have lots and lots of stories that I've written since then. And it's getting to be close to my having the number of stories I might need to make another collection. I have people telling me I have to write a novel, and I understand how you have to write a novel. It's like that in the publishing world. Novels are what go, not collections. For a short time after my second time at Kenyon, I found an agent in New York who tried hard to sell the collection, and she loved the work, but it wasn't happening. It was too Midwest. It was too, how shall I say, the demographics, the zeitgeist just wasn't right. And so we parted ways amicably, and I'm back to working on my own, submitting. I don't know if a novel is in me, but I probably will put out another collection, or will try to anyway. Lots of stories are in the hopper. They happen to me. They occur to me all the time. I don't even understand where they come from. As, again, your guest, Jeff Whittle, I think it was Jeff, said it's all a mystery. I barely know what I'm doing. I just pump it out. And the people speak through me. When I'm doing my best, it speaks through me. I was driving with my wife a couple of years ago along a street near her home, and there was a old lady who was mowing the yard. And she was so old and bent over that the lawnmower was essentially holding her up like a walker. And after noticing her that day, I noticed her thereafter many times. And then one day there was a young woman, not so young, maybe 45 or 50 years old, mowing instead. And after that time, she was always mowing. And so I said to myself, well, the old lady's either dead or she's upstairs and just can't do it anymore. And the young woman is her daughter. And I never saw anyone else but those two. And of course, I thought about those people. And I talked to my wife about those people, thought. And before long, they were speaking through me as characters, whether or not literally those people lived the lives that I wrote about in my story. I don't know. But that's where the stuff comes from. It's the most amazing thing. I just can't turn it off.
And that's great. It's great that you have an outlet for that. And, whether we know where it comes from or not, the fact that it comes out is the important part.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, what's a book that you've read recently that couldn't put down?
Well, I was thinking about that. Flannery O'Connor is my North Star. She always has been. And I return to her. I don't know how acquainted you are with her. I'm more inclined to read kind of the classic of modern literature than I am the new stuff. However, I did just finish Bonnie Jo Campbell's The Water and was deeply impacted by it. Bonnie Jo Campbell is a wonderful writer and also wrote a short story collection called Mothers Tell Your Daughters, which I highly recommend. Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son is a short story collection, which I read again and again, especially a couple of stories in it. I like them because out of the brutality comes I don't want to say necessarily grace, but light, enlightenment out of the brutality. And sometimes people maybe pay with their lives, but the bill that came due was a bill that the reader perhaps understands and is enlightened by. That's certainly true in O'Connor. I have always loved Alice Munro. It's a little difficult to talk about now because of the Alice Munro news, but her characters dig deep into a kind of an interiority that I would like to be good at. I mean, a whole story can happen in 20 minutes time, but it goes on and on and on because of the characters thinking. And I'm more of a meat and potatoes action moving forward sort of writer. But I'm very impacted by Alice Munro, and then it's not like I can ever turn my back completely on Hemingway either for the pithiness and the clean lines. Big Two-Hearted River, I would read, every day for the rest of my life and be awed anew as I would be by the snows of Kilimanjaro, one of his other stories.
I was wondering, what is one of your favorite parts about the creative process?
Well, I guess I've been talking about it already. My favorite part of the creative process is how it never stops coming. I suppose it will. I suppose it will over time. It hasn't yet. I was watching football yesterday and thinking to myself that someone 40 years younger than I would be approaching the time that they were too old to play in the NFL. So, I have thoughts about my physicality. I have thoughts about my fragility, but my brain hasn't turned off yet. And that's my favorite part of it. And I love creating characters. I love how they, as I said, speak through me. I love how they sometimes, often surprise me if I'm quiet and listen. That's my favorite part.
Yeah, I enjoy that part too. I don't have anything published, but I've written poems, I've written prose, I've written songs and song lyrics, and I love the surprise and the spontaneity and the unpredictability of where our minds take us.
You look up and you say, "Where'd that come from?"
Yeah.
And at your best, that's what it's. A great friend and mentor of mine call it a happy accident. What's that happy accident?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
If you've been feeling burned out, stressed, overwhelmed, or exhausted, the resources and courses at the Self-Care Institute are here to support you. The Self-Care Institute was founded by Dr. Ami Kunimura and provides support for individuals and organizations with burnout prevention, burnout recovery, and stress management. I've personally taken a few of these courses and found them to be super helpful, both professionally and personally. The care you give yourself matters just as much as the care you give to others. But if self-care is difficult for you, you're not alone. And the Self-Care Institute is here to support your well-being, resilience, and sense of fulfillment at work and at home. For more information, visit selfcareinstitute.com or go to the show notes and click on the link. What is a piece of advice that you would impart to people wanting to get into a creative field, or even to yourself when you were younger?
Well, I would say that they have to find a balance, a kind of a balance between arrogance and humility. The arrogance, which is to say, I can do this. I know I've got something. I've got something. I've got something here. I'm not just playing tiddlywinks. I've got something. And even in my rougher times in Iowa, when my stories would get ravaged in the workshops, I had a kind of an arrogance to me then even. I mean, I was a nice guy. I've always been a nice guy. And I wouldn't say, you people are stupid. I wouldn't do that. But I would also know that there was something to what I'd created. But then you got to combine that with humility. And you've got to listen to your critic, to your writer friends who you ask to read your work, to your professors, to your inner voice, to the masters, to the people that you've read that are teaching you, from perhaps years before. And also you have to edit. You have to just, every word. I mean, I have a great friend that writes so well. He has such good ideas, but he doesn't believe in the craft. Sometimes I think he thinks that merely spilling it out is good enough. It stands by itself because you spilled it out as raw and good and real. Okay, yeah, but now you have to hone it. Now you have to edit and craft and check your spelling, for heaven's sakes, and all kinds of things. And so I guess, I don't know, in answer to your question, arrogance, humility, honor the craft with hard work, with the hard work that's necessary. But also, to anybody, I would say never give up, because if something is prompting you to do it, well, there's something in there, right? I mean, as a musician, you would agree. If something is prompting you to do it, then there's something real in there, that little voice, and you've got to listen to the voice and not give up. I guess that would be my advice.
Yeah. Excellent advice. And, definitely things that I feel like sometimes I need a reminder of on occasion, from time to time.
Yeah, of course. Well, you do. You have your low points, and you have your times, at least I do in my writing, where I realize that I'm not listening to the voice, I'm not listening to the characters, but I'm just grinding it out for the sake of finishing something. And that's often not very good writing when I'm all done, because I'm just making it up. I'm not letting it happen.
I know you've mentioned that you've, always been an ideas person, always been a writer at heart, but if you could sort of dabble in any other creative outlet just for fun, what would you want to try?
Well, I have done painting. In fact, my Instagram account, WriterBob50, all lowercase, WriterBob50, has a handful of my pastels. So I've taken pastel classes. The only reason I stopped is because, at least in my particular case, it was all landscapes, and I had to move on. I didn't feel like I wanted, and I wasn't. I was okay at landscapes, but I wanted to write or draw more interesting and other stuff, and I just let it go. I let it pass. I'm kind of ashamed to say that I did, and I want to get back to it. But there's that anyway. I'm not a musician. I actually majored in music my first year of college because I had a good singing voice, but I had no clue otherwise about chords and the keyboards and the like, and didn't have, again, the focus or the desire to get down to it. In a way, I'm blessed with the writing thing, and it's something I'm sort of naturally made for. And I'm happy to do the work with the writing. I'm happy to work every day. I'm happy to get up and write. Think about people taking piano lessons and having to do the scales over and over and over and making them crazy. Well, I don't know. I don't have that necessarily in writing. I don't have the drills to go through, the etude to practice and practice and practice. I just write, and then I edit, and then I write it and I throw it out. My friend, again, at Indiana University, Leonard Michaels, said he was talking in class about tone. And I said, when I sat with him over lunch one day, I said, what tone? I mean, why striking a tone in your fiction? I said, I just write it until I feel like it's done, and then I stop. And he says, yeah, that's what you do. So anyway, I've never been exactly a student of it as much as it just happens to me.
Who has been one of the biggest influences on your life? It doesn't necessarily have to be an author, just in general even.
Well, I had a friend in college, again, friend, mentor, teacher. His name was Nicholas Lindsay. And Nick was the son of the American poet Vachel Lindsay, who traveled in Robert Frost circles. And I wrote about Nick actually in my most recent newsletter, which people can sign up for on my website. Nick, I used to take my stories to him, and it was when I was very young, and it was kind of a Hemingway phase with a lot of what I would call masculine themes of violence and extremity, like Jack London characters building a fire and people dying in bullfights and stuff. And I would take those to Nick, and one day he gave me a story back and said, get close to her. I said, her? Who's her? What do you mean, get close to her? And he wouldn't say. He would just said, get to her. And then I took the story that we were talking about back to him, and he looks at it briefly and says, okay, now write it again 7 times. And so he was taking me on this kind of mythical quest. And her, I've come to think, you said, write about the yin and the yang. Don't just write about you and where you come from and your scabbed bloody knees and stuff and from falling off bikes or whatever. Write about the whole thing. Get close to her. And I would say there have been other wonderful influences in my life, but it seems to me as time has gone by that perhaps is the most impact advice I ever received from a critic. That if you're a male writer, you should get close to her. And that doesn't necessarily mean write about women, but it means don't just write about, as I say, those traditionally male topics of kind of Hemingway topics. Broaden your sensibilities, go deeper, go wider, write about the yin and the yang.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense to you, but there it is.
Yeah. And so important to, like you said, having a wider scope and really getting in touch with the humanity and the lens there,
I couldn't have written my Continental Divide story without that sensibility of, and again, I don't necessarily mean writing about a female lead protagonist, but getting close to her means broadening the story away from just LT and the Lady Edith's grandson, Wallace, but also writing about her and Wallace's girlfriend, Aubrey, and what all happened then. So there you go.
I was curious, what's been one of the biggest surprises you've had regarding your book?
Well, it's been well received so far. I mean, it's not out yet. By the time this podcast airs, it perhaps will be because it's coming out February 11th. So it's right around the corner. It's been well received. I'd say one of the biggest surprises is just that I was talking to a friend many years ago, and he had written his PhD thesis, and it was, I think it was religion, New Testament stuff. And I said, and the thesis was essentially a book. And I said something to him about, I can't imagine taking on a whole book. And he said, no, you just write a little bit every day. Just write a little bit every day. And before you know it, you're there. And I'd say that's kind of true. I never dreamed that I'd have 14 stories that had a kind of a, I mean, the collection is not a linked collection, although some characters do recur. But there's not an arch to it. It doesn't have a novel feel. But the notion of just sticking with it, and one day you wake up and you've got enough for a book. Holy cow. I never dreamed I could do that. But that, again, is what comes from retirement, having a lot of time. You'll know one day.
Yep, one day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining the show, sharing your wisdom, sharing the history of how you got to where you are. I'm excited for your writing journey and, Continental Divide out in February. And listeners can check the show notes to either pre-order or purchase, depending on when they're listening to this. But any lasting words before we stop?
I don't think so. I feel like we've covered a whole heck of a lot. My dad was a writer. He wrote for gardening journals, and he published in things like the Journal of the Scottish Rock Garden. And he's a nurseryman in northern Indiana, and he publishes in magazines in Europe. And I as a 14-year-old boy, I was both intensely proud of him because he was a published writer, and I was also kind of embarrassed because he wrote about lilies, and Scottish rock gardens when here I was trying to play baseball and stuff. I don't know. It isn't exactly advice, but if you have a dream, chase it. That's all.
Excellent. Well, Bob, thank you again for being on the show. And listeners, please check the show notes. Thank you for supporting all of our artists, authors, actors, creators, and for the show. And make sure to leave reviews, not just for the authors, but for the podcast and other podcasts as well, because that's how we keep going. As always, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Creative Piecemeal. We hope today's episode left you feeling inspired. This podcast is independently created and produced by the host, Tammy Takaishi. More details about today's guest can be found in the show notes, along with links to the podcast's socials, merch store, and ways to support arts organizations AHA Broadway and New Normal Rep, both near and dear to Tammy's heart. Don't forget to visit creativepiecemeal.com, the official podcast website, where you can leave fan mail, write a review, explore Tammy's blog, and discover the growing collection of episodes. Special thanks to our audio engineer, Alex Repetti. Additional narration by Dante Jace. Let's keep celebrating creativity in all its forms.